Yeah.
Well, we need to make sure that other people can hear.
Oh, so the people. Wait a minute.
Hi. I'm a case manager from Ramsey County. And when you work in this profession, obviously you're in tune with all these kind of things that go on in our world. And I've been paying attention to lately is just the amount of violence in our society, which is pretty prevalent and growing. And I think humor has been a savings grace because it allows us to kind of get through things and laugh about things. But I think, and my question to you guys is, do you think humor at some point has desensitized our perception of what is violent? And then also, a different question too, what do you think are the top 3 contributors to violence in our society? And there isn't a right or wrong answer. I just want to hear what you have to say.
Dave's going to get that one.
Well, I guess I can just, so has humor desensitized us to violence? I think that certainly the humor that we see in Warner Brothers cartoons, really the kids start seeing from the moment before they can speak, is one example of how kids witness violence and then find humor in it. But I agree with you. It's a two-edged sword. It both desensitizes us to it, but can also be a coping mechanism.
Because I listen to a talk show sometimes on the way to work. It's a KQ morning show, and they address real issues that are going on in the world, but they're always kind of splicing a lot of humor in it. And I think it's maybe for them as announcers to kind of keep the pulse of their show and not kind of get too lost into the realities. Like they were highlighting the 4-year-old that was brutally beat in Minneapolis, and I mean it's shocking as to, you know, I mean without digressing any further, but
right, there's a lot of humor that's just crossing the line that they try to push limits, but it ends up.
Well, they had, like, for instance, Tammy Faye, when she was near her end, she, with courage, was on national audience and said, to all the people that she's interacted with, said, I love you guys and all this kind of stuff. And they had her on there as like, try the Tammy Faye diet, and I mean, that's sometimes humor that crosses the line of what's...
I do think, having spent a lot of time working with first responders, so I've been working with police officers for probably more than 10 years, about 12 years now. And apart from the fact, I probably shouldn't say this in a large audience, that my alcohol tolerance has increased. The humor is really used in a very powerful way to protect them from the horrible things, horrific things they've seen. And sometimes that's really shocking to people outside, people who are not cops. We took a group of 20 officers and clinicians up to Brainerd a few years ago. Actually, it was about as cold as this, and we had to tow half the police cars back to Minneapolis because it was so cold. But we spent a couple of days together learning about development and policing and trauma. And I'll never forget our wonderful administrative assistant. We were sitting just after hours joking, and they were talking about just some really awful, gory scenes they'd said. She just went paler and paler and paler. And so, sometimes what crosses the line to us enables other people to continue doing their work. And so it is, I think as David said, it is a double-edged sword. But yeah, humor's a very powerful protector sometimes. So.
Other questions?
There's one over there. Oh.
Early on, you talked about agitated motor behavior being one of the things you see with PTSD. And I know that that's sometimes part of the way that they diagnose ADHD. Are those two things, are they often misdiagnosed, or are they kind of interchangeable as far as diagnoses go? And
it's a really, really, really good question. Thank you for asking that question. And probably everyone heard it because of the mic. Yes, ADHD is overdiagnosed, and yes, sometimes it's misdiagnosed, and it should be, and the correct diagnosis should be PTSD. And obviously, as you can see, there are some symptoms that are common to both ADHD and PTSD. And so on the surface, a teacher's frustrated with a kid in class, and sends the kid to this, the kid's had some disciplinary stuff, and nobody really knows what's going on at home, and the kid, ADHD is a really easy diagnosis to make. A lot of primary care providers prescribe Ritalin. And in Minnesota, there's a problem with access to tertiary care providers in psychiatry. And I think, in greater Minnesota in psychology also. And so these kids get misdiagnosed. And I think it's really problematic because kids get labeled as behavior problems. And what's really driving it is the agitation secondary to PTSD. And there's also a lot of problems I think we're just learning about how PTSD looks in kids, especially little kids who can't really report to us what's going on. And, add that to the fact that people are avoidant, they don't really want to talk about trauma, or it might not be safe for kids to talk about what's going on. It's very complicated. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, it just speaks to the importance, I think, of screening for trauma histories when you're doing any mental health evaluation or in general in the general population, because it's so easily confused.
I have a question from outstate Minnesota. This is from Todd County. What about imaginary friends in school-age kids? Is this an indicator of trauma?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a really good question. Well, imaginary friends are part of normal development anyway, so that's the first thing that's important to say. Imaginary friends are, they're cool. They're really protective for kids. Some kids more than others. I think I'm smiling because I was just reading my daughter a book about an imaginary friend, and it's written by a little girl who feels shy and lonely, and she gets bullied in school, and so she invokes her imaginary friend who protects her. Does that mean that the presence of imaginary friends is correlated with trauma? I don't know of any research to really to shed light on that. So I would be really careful about making generalizations. I don't think the person asking the question is suggesting we do that. But, like David said, the key to all this is doing a good assessment and figuring out what's going on based on history. Yeah.
I have another question from Greater Minnesota. This one's from Rochester. How does a clinician get involved in the intensive training program beyond the 10-week online training?
I did not pay that person. That's great. I can plug, right? We are midway through this year's Learning Collaborative, but if there is enough interest, we will certainly consider doing another statewide Learning Collaborative next year. And so I urge you, if you're interested, to shoot me an email and I'll make sure it gets to the right person. And we will chat with DHS and see if they'll be interested in collaborating with us. So far, I think, how would you report back on our first Learning Collaborative?
Oh, they're wonderful. We have Jennifer Wilgocki as the lead consultant, and I'm an assistant consultant to 5 different sites. And
it's actually 8.
8?
Yeah.
Okay. And they're going well. I think it's a very rich learning experience, both in learning the fundamental components of TFCBT as well as case consultation.
Yeah, I mean, the caveat is that it does require some energy on some effort and resources on the part of agencies. The way we've structured it is we did have a kind of RFP process, so agencies have to be ready to devote the resources to doing this kind of a practice. And they have to be willing to, for example, allow clinicians to devote a certain amount of time to consultation, to things that aren't billable. And the collaboration, Minnesota DHS has been fabulous in that they've provided a mini grant of $5,000 to each agency to offset the cost of the training and the cost of training staff, which isn't reimbursable. So it's not, it's a little bit more complicated and, hey, I'll do it and I'll join. That, that it's an investment. I think it's an investment that's worth it. But certainly if you're interested, if your agency is interested, shoot us an email and we'll chat with DHS again about doing a second Learning Collaborative.
I have a question in regards to violent media that children are exposed to. Is there any age group that would be more affected by seeing, for instance, R-rated movies or cable TV shows? And my question stemmed from an incident in which a child that was about 3, I had seen at a Lord of the Rings movie where they had like heads on stakes and things like that. And I'm wondering if any of that media would affect children or be considered traumatic to them or not, because it's not real life.
Do you want to start?
Sure.
Talk too
I'll
much.
throw it over to you. But yeah, I mean, there's a certain developmental level that kids need to achieve in order to understand that something is fantasy versus reality, and a 3-year-old is not there yet. That's the same reason that it's not ethical to market to kids, is because they don't understand that commercials aren't real.
So I guess my question is then, if a child is like under 5 and maybe only has the, can only repeat, oh, it's not real, instead of knowing that, would that be something that they could take as is actually happening if they were to see it on TV?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know if any of you have seen Bandura's, the video footage of Al Bandura's now famous experiments with the Bobo doll. I had the opportunity just to show this to my class last week, where young children were shown models who were seen punching and kicking this Bobo doll, and children not only repeated, so they basically, kids were divided into kids who saw, you know, benign, you know, playroom with objects and a person behaving in a benign way, and the same playroom with the same objects with a person behaving in an aggressive way towards this bouncy doll called a Bobo doll. And children, you know, this was the first time that we really clearly saw the effects of modeling. Kids who saw the aggressive behavior were much more likely to model it, not just doing exactly what the actor did, but also finding new creative ways to hit the Bobo doll, using guns which the person hadn't done, toy guns, or using other dolls to bash the Bobo doll. And so, yes, 3-year-olds, I mean, that, you know, I often spend time talking with parents about what not to let your children see, because there is a modeling effect of violent media. So it's hard, and especially for kids who aren't yet of the age to understand the difference between reality and fantasy.
Hi. My question is, how do you help those children that have been through many crisis situations and then a huge traumatic event happens and say within days they're back to their normal schedule, and eventually throw out small questions about the situation but never seem to show that they're really affected by it?
So it's a complex trauma. Is that
Well, I think are you saying children who've been traumatized many times, or kids who just are living a life and then something happens, boom, and then they go back to their life?
Right, and just, I mean, do you address it with them, or do you let them lead it where it comes back up, or do you, you know?
It's a really good question. So let's take a kid, let's take an example of the bridge disaster, right? 35W bridge disaster. We know there were kids on a school bus on the bridge, so as well as kids who were affected by the death of the people who died on the bridge, and kids who lived near or who saw what happened. And that's a single incident, and it's quite possible that it has ramifications. Obviously, for children who lost parents, the ramifications are huge. But for children who went through a discrete incident like that, as a parent, say, or as someone who's with the child, you don't want to sort of shove the incident down their throat. You want to let them lead and ask questions at the developmentally appropriate stage they're at. So in the same, a good example is thinking about death. So we know that children don't understand that people who die don't come back until they're a little older, until they're well into school age. Kids don't understand that death is irreversible, that once you die, you're gone, you never come back. And so trying to explain that to a child who's 5 or 6 years old won't really get you anywhere. So it's much better to follow their lead. The thing is, you have to sort of balance, so now this is, as a parent, you now have to balance wanting to follow their lead and also not ignoring it or denying that it happened. Because I think we often have the sort of feeling of, oh, it happened, it's over, and he seems to be okay, so I'm not even going to go there. And that's not so great. because the children are very sensitive and they get the idea that this is something we don't talk about. So it's a little bit of a balancing act.
What about a child who maybe has made a lifestyle adaptation of just sort of putting trauma behind them, and they may have experienced repeated trauma and just don't have a reaction anymore?
Yeah. Well, those are the kids that we're really worried about if they've made these like developmental adaptations. So delinquency would be one path, or the girl who, the girl who gets into risky sexual encounters as a kind of chronic adaptation to the things that she's been exposed to. And so those are the kids where it's harder to figure out what has gone on, because there's been a lot more time since the event. And that kind of behavior, delinquent behavior, can be a result of many things, not just trauma. And so this again goes back to the idea of assessment and providing appropriate treatment. By the way, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is not just for kids who have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's appropriate for children who've been through a traumatic event and have numerous different kinds of symptoms in reaction. So general anxiety or depression or acting out, even substance abuse. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to help with all those different kinds of symptoms as long as they're secondary to a traumatic event. So
in those cases, maybe the exposure isn't if a child is desensitized to violence because there's been so many traumas, maybe the exposure isn't the main force of change in the therapy, but some of the skills might take more importance. Self-regulation skills, behavioral management, those types of things.
By the way, David didn't spend an awful lot of time on the trauma narrative, but in kids who've had experienced many traumatic events, you can do a lifeline, which basically, I didn't talk about it, but I'm working with some colleagues in Germany who do this remarkable trauma treatment for survivors of war and torture in refugee camps around the world. And they have very simple therapeutic tools. They have a piece of string and stones and flowers, and they use this piece of string to represent the lifeline, and they use stones to represent traumatic events that occurred and flowers to represent happy events, and they do the exposure as a life narrative. That's called narrative exposure therapy, for those of you who are interested.
I have another question from Todd County. This is about anxiety at bedtime. How do you determine whether they were hurt at that time of the day or if it is just a way of showing they are tired?
Do you want to take it?
Assessment, I think, asking the child about if anything had happened. Like Abby said, if you don't ask, they won't say it. They won't mention it. And so that would be where I would start with that situation.
Anxiety at bedtime is very normative.
Yeah.
I mean, do we remember any kids who didn't have some anxiety around bedtime? I mean, it's dark, darkness can be scary, and then you have to, and you're tired, and who knows what will happen when you close your eyes for kids who have nightmares and things like that. So I think it's always hard to disentangle, and this is, remember when I was talking in early childhood about how you don't know, what you see in traumatized kids are fears that don't seem to have anything to do with the traumatic event. Everything's multi-determined. And so that's why it's really important to go back and carefully document to the degree you can what happened. I think it's problematic. One of my thoughts is that maybe this a foster parent, for example, who doesn't know a child's history, and that's really difficult. And I just want to acknowledge that's a really difficult situation when you have a child. You take a child into your home and you want to help them, and you don't exactly know what they've been through. I would say that, to the extent you can, and to the extent that it disrupts how, there's a difference between a kid who's anxious at bedtime but who can be calmed down, and a child who becomes hysterical and screams for 2 hours at bedtime over a course of 3 months. And I think we would all be able to say, that the latter child probably, could get some mental health help. So.
We're getting the signal from our timekeeper that we only have time for one more question. I see a gentleman with a microphone in his hand, so.
Well, I'll hope it's a good one then. My question revolves around the kind of families that I work with, where there is lots of chronic chaos and the influence that that chronic chaos has leading up to a trauma event, and then trying to deal with the trauma event when the chronic chaos is likely going to continue on some level after the fact.
Yeah. So you have layers. You have chaos, trauma, chaos, and actually, Kathy Spatz-Widom, who I mentioned earlier, has found an interesting finding in her research that what predicts PTSD is not so much the traumatic event as the chaos that goes alongside it, or precedes it, or follows it. And so that stuff, that chaos, the disruptions, I work a lot with homelessness, that other stuff, sometimes it's impossible to disentangle, is a difficult condition. And that's actually what got me interested in parent training as an intervention. You know, to the extent that you're going to be able to help, if you have a child who's suffering from PTSD, then that's pretty clear, and you want to be able to help the child, but you've got to be able to help the family system in terms of helping parents protect their children. We're doing this, I mentioned our pilot of parenting through change in a shelter. We're now conducting these groups in 5 supportive housing sites around the metro area. We've completed 3, and we're just doing the other 2. And these are examples of families who really have struggled with many, many different disruptions, and vast majority of the time traumatic events on top of the disruptions. And the key is to be able to provide a containing atmosphere that can facilitate parents to support their children. So.
Yeah, I'd say at a minimum, if there's further risk of trauma, at a minimum, the child or the victim of trauma can't be still living with the perpetrator of the trauma for this therapy to work. And then you can work around the containment, which
right.
as a case manager, you know.
Right, so basic safety, of course, you have to. Thank you for mentioning that.
I want to thank David and Abby for a wonderful presentation, and thank our audience here and around the state. Look forward to seeing you at our future events, and please remember to hand in your evaluations and pick up your certificates of attendance as you leave. Thank you very much.